I want to thank first everyone here at Wolf, Ayako, Julia, Caitlin, Jennifer, Pamela, and the entire organizing staff. This is such a great event, and I'm really happy to be here. Let me really quickly see. Okay, cool. When I was asked to be on a panel about truth and environmental crisis, I realized this was a singular opportunity to bring, likely for the first time, Alexander Rodchenko, Nigaryan, and Bers Mikhailov into conversation. These three artist photographers who, while separated by the better part of a century, working across Russian, Armenian, and Ukrainian contexts within the Soviet and post-Soviet space, provide a singular opportunity to explore the following questions. How do artist photographers witness environmental catastrophe, and how is truth negotiated across these different temporalities of crisis? Through Rodchenko, Nigaryan, and Mikhailov, we encounter three modes or temporalities of crisis, what I deem the present, the looming, and the enduring. I will first examine Rodchenko's photo essay in the publication USSR in Construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, produced under Stalinist Commission as a site of conflicted response to a crisis of the present, one that simultaneously conceals the vast human cost of forced labor and violent terraforming, while often undermining the very propagandistic effort it serves. I contrast this with the looming, anticipatory nature of Nigaryan's Explosions 84, a series of experimental photographs shot in Lindee in 1984, 4 years before the Spitak earthquake devastated the city. Nigaryan's abstract experimentation laid bare what he described as the, quote, role of intuition that art may carry. An unknowing articulation, that is, of a looming catastrophe. Finally, I turn to Bers Mikhailov's two series, Salt Lake and Temptation of Life, which engage in enduring crisis. Mikhailov renders visible the toxicities and decay that, while existing in plain sight, remain socially unseen. And when I get to Mikhailov, I'm going to ask everyone to come up. I brought part of the Salt Lake series that's laid out on the table. As long as you are not in front of the podium, you getting around and looking at them, considering how many people we have, is no problem. So together, emerging from within and against the visual, political, and cultural regimes of the Soviet and post-Soviet context, their work reveals how the environment is witnessed, conveyed, and transformed, and how photography can mediate between visibility and concealment in moments of ecological and human crisis. So the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal was central to Stalin's first five-year plan, designed to connect the seas and, quote, reforge or re-educate through forced labor. Using 175,000 prisoners, between 25,000 and 50,000 of whom died, the canal was built with at best rudimentary technology, but more often essentially by hand. Rodchenko's work for the December 1933 issue of USSR in Construction is the result of three separate trips to this camp, and it was a state propaganda effort aimed at both domestic and foreign audiences, framing this labor camp as a humane re-education project, a narrative of conquering wild nature and wild human nature. For Rodchenko, however, this commission was also profoundly personal, having recently been expelled from the October group for, quote, bourgeois formalism, and no real avenue for publishing his work. As Aglaya Glebova, the leading voice on Rodchenko, notes, the photographer would later refer to his travels to the canal as, quote, his salvation. And I quote, reciting canal propaganda, he wrote about the camp as a place of gigantic will, where man fought against untamed nature and reconstructed himself. Glebova reads Rodchenko's photo essays and photo constructions as filled with what she calls moments of fissure, in which the layouts fail to provide a single cohesive ideological reading. While the narrative arc, as we can see here, from wild to civilized, while the narrative arc attempts to show this reforging of a chaotic world into a socialist one, the images, though intended as a sanitized view, inadvertently betray the primitive state of technology and the Sisyphean nature, as Glebova calls it, of forced human labor. What interests me, though, in her reading is what these fissures produce, not simply failed propaganda, but an excess of meaning that such propagandistic language cannot contain, a simultaneous concealment of the vast human cost and an undermining of propagandistic intent. Such excess surfaces throughout this series. Maybe. Nope. Yep, there we go. In one of the most striking montages that luckily we were able to see, the attack on land, the entire composition is tinted in cyan, invoking a blueprint, as Glebova masterfully argues. The crisis of the body of the earth is recorded and reordered into a clean narrative on several levels, a chaotic overabundance in the face of rational order. We see a structure of reforging through inhumane re-education, reforging and conquering through violent terraforming, and a literal reforging of bodies by Rodchenko himself, who reuses prisoners' bodies, slogans, and explosions across the issues in his photo montage. What should be seen as ideological, industrial, and human abundance is flattened and shown to be truly scarce. Through such formal logic, these conditions that are meant to be concealed are actually brought to the fore. And even here, if you can see up there, we see a detail where Rodchenko has placed a tiny cutout over the eye patch of a prisoner. You can see just right next to the pole on the left, highlighting exactly what it seeks to cover, drawing the viewer's eye to a detail otherwise likely overlooked. It is exactly these moments that lead to this chaotic overabundance. And if you see the original, did I take it out? I think I took it out. Anyway. His attempts to project an idea, but the very form, or his work attempts to project an idea, but the very form, the jagged cuts and duplication of bodies refuses to be fully resolved. What Glebova identifies as fissures, I frame as excess, a surplus of meaning produced by the very limits of photographic language and propaganda in the face of environmental and human violence. Here, crisis is present, concealed, and yet still overflowing. But the question arises, what happens when crisis has not yet arrived, when there's nothing yet to conceal, and yet the image registers it all the same? Nigaryan was born in 1950, coming of age artistically at the end of 1970s in Yerevan's unofficial exhibition and performance culture. While his painting, designs, and posters have gained their deserved place in Armenia's art historical landscape, what is referred to as the well-kept secret of his photographic work is only now coming to the fore, with the artist only agreeing to exhibit his work in 2011, which was actually also the year of his death. His photographic practice, exclusively black and white, breaks from any claim to the photograph's indexical truth through direct interference with the negative, collage and painting, scratching out faces or details, or scratching in figures, ideas, and information. It is within this context of formal experimentation that we encounter Explosions 84. The curator and art historian Viggen Gastelyan describes Nigaryan's aesthetic as, quote, an implosive device, always on the point of cataclysmic change. Indeed, what we see in Explosions 84 confounds simple categorization, a gestural application that may appear sloppy or casual, but in fact, as Gastelyan notes, always carefully calculated. And this often raises an immediate and fundamental question: are these photographs? Are they drawings? Are they paintings? Perhaps none of the above. As seen in the photographer's own records, the stakes of this question move far beyond the aesthetic. The series, he explains, was shot 4 years before the Spitak earthquake devastated the city. His experimental processing of the negatives, what he called a, quote, special way of displaying negatives and subsequent special processing, produced the blurry, explosive character of the images. For the photographer-artist, the coincidence was not accidental. End quote. The devastating earthquake, he writes, directly, question mark, or indirectly, question mark, confirms the role of intuition that a work of art can carry. The artist practice consistently sought to bring the past into the present and trying to understand the future through such contradicting forms and methods. And in Nigaryan's own words, quote, "The truth will bulge out of your work." The artist himself underscores his excess by later drawing attention to the city's renaming Leninakan, so after Lenin, to Gyumri, so the Soviet name Shed. And yet, the photographs still bear the marks of what came before, as well as the impending crisis. The series was not created as prophecy, though it is often talked about that way. Nigaryan's own question marks, directly or indirectly, reveal his attempts to reckon with that which he did not produce. And yet it is precisely this witnessing without knowing that gives the work its force. Intuition operating beneath the threshold of conscious intent, the artist sensing what could not yet be seen or named. His work serves to connect environments, natural, cultural, political, across time. The explosive device, or implosive device that Gastian describes in Nigaryan's work becomes legible as something more than formal experimentation. This blurry, explosive character of the image is now inseparable from the devastation that followed. So while Rodchenko's documentary in propagandistic mode registers present crisis, something happening now to be concealed or transformed, Nigaryan's abstract mode registers crisis differently, a catastrophe that is yet to arrive, but is already in some sense preternaturally present in the image. The gap between the carefully calculated surface and the looming chaos they serve to witness produces a tension between control and eruption that mirrors the geological event itself. With Boris Mikhailov, crisis is neither hidden behind propagandistic forms nor announces itself through intuition. It persists underneath the surface. And I invite everyone, as you would like, to come up and look at the first series, which we'll be talking about. Where are we? Boris Mikhailov was born in 1938 in Kharkiv and is widely considered the first unofficial Soviet photographer. An engineer by education and self-taught as a photographer, he began his artistic practice in a factory laboratory, using its equipment to develop his own work, a practice that eventually drew the attention of the local KGB, resulting in his interrogation and quick dismissal. From the onset, Mikhailov's work has interrogated not only the inner and outer self of the new Soviet collective, but also his own role as an observer and participant in an ever-changing landscape. Despite international acclaim for decades, the photographer first received official recognition at home only in 2020, with the Shevchenko National Prize, a gap between the external and internal, the foreign and domestic visibility, which is itself central to understanding his work. To understand what Mikhailov makes visible in these series, it's worth attending first to how his work operates as a whole, as it's particularly tempting to read his gaze as purely ironic or cynical. What one critic has called a, quote, destructive and mocking act with no reformatory goal. These are two versions of his autobiography. But such readings often neglect something crucial. As Yelena Petrovskaya states, Mikhailov's object is not directly unequivocal against ideology, but much more blurred, connected with human manifestations with life. Mikhailov dissects Homo post-Sovieticus not as a self-superior anthropologist, but as one wishing to discover what is inside himself as well. The removal of oneself, Mikhailov insists, is not possible. And it is from this impossibility that this witnessing derives such force. Bodies, landscape, eroticism, and the entanglement of human and environmental vulnerability. He is not a removed documentarian arriving to record devastation. He is, as ever, in between, simultaneously within and without, what I call an engineer after the fact, who must poke and prod within to better understand the faulty machine of which he is a part. And it's from this position that we encounter two of his series, Salt Lake and Temptation of Life. So we have Salt Lake up here. So Salt Lake was shot in 1986 in the Donbass region of southern Ukraine. and was among the first of Mikhailov's series focused as much on the individual as on their surroundings. The series was shot in sepia, documenting Soviet bathers at a popular bathing spot whose warm, salty water was believed to have medicinal properties. In fact, the lake was heavily polluted and an industrial site. Its hot water, the discharge of a sodium factory along its shore. Picnicking by railroad tracks, swimming in and alongside and on top of industrial pipes, the bathers are, as one critic has put it, quote, either stalwart or delusional. While the salt lake is supposed to have healing effects, what is registered in an environmental crisis at both the natural and human level essentially exists beneath the water's surface. And yet Mikhailov documents this world as if from within, not a hidden voyeur, though he often claims this. Even here, he occupies the in-between, not the secret observer, but also not the welcome participant either, registering from within the scene and what those inside it cannot or will not see. This is all the more poignant when considering that the series was shot around the same time as the Chernobyl disaster. So picnicking by railroad tracks, nope. With Temptation of Life, we have something completely different. Mikhailov deliberately mixes temporalities. The inspiration for this project was an unfinished crematorium in Kiev, whose construction had been mired in conflicts since its inception in 1969. What followed was an accumulation of attempts to hide or erase. The original design was in fact rejected for fear it would evoke the extermination of Ukrainian Jews in Nazi concentration camps, an attempt to erase historical as well as personal memory. The revised plan was a modernist project that included a large park and a wall of memory. But after more than a decade of work, the government covered the wall in concrete, declaring it incompatible with the, quote, principles of socialist realism. We see then that the official abandonment of place that was not for the transformation of land, but for the transformation of bodies, a crematorium to ash. And yet in that abandonment, in this accumulation of erasures, a different transformation took hold, the landscape reclaiming what the state left behind. When Mikhailov visited the crematorium in 2017, the encounter led him not only to create a series based around its slow decay, but also to reconsider and revisit his previous 6 decades of work. The series takes the form of more than 150 diptychs, half shot on the territory of the abandoned crematorium and the rest drawn from across Mikhailov's career, joining the images of high, low, natural, artificial, beautiful, ugly. As Mikhailov notes, quote, before I did not take pictures like this. I did not put pictures from other places and other times together. Perhaps I'm employing the diptych now because it's not possible to explain something with just one picture. No single temporality can contain what is being witnessed. Past and present, juxtaposed within each pair, produce a visual manifestation of this creeping continual crisis, perpetual haunting by the material lives and afterlives of socialism. The book edition of Temptation of Life, you see there, enacts the in-between, blurred, unstable at the level of form. It contains no dates, no introduction, no conclusion, and no text of any kind, a marked absence in a body of work almost always accompanied by such materials. What exists in plain sight in Mikhailov's work nevertheless remains imperceptible, unnoticed, and the series stages this difference at every level. As Ilya Kabakov noted regarding Mikhailov's infamous case history, the photographer's approach confounds many Western connoisseurs, who approach his photographs as simplistic reportage, a portrait of decaying post-Soviet life, rather than something altogether more complex. This is perhaps nowhere more visible than in a detail hidden, fittingly, in plain sight. The series actually exists under 2 completely different titles: Temptation of Life in its English language book edition, and Trial by Death, Испытание смертью, in Russian, the title under which Mikhailov won the Shevchenko National Prize in 2020, his first official recognition in his home country. There's an excess and evolving instability inherent. Temptation and trial, life and death, a final diptych hidden in plain sight, playing with the associations, expectations, and prejudices of those who encounter it. Where Rodchenko's crisis is concealed in the present tense, in Nigaryan's is sensed before it arrives, Mikhailov witnesses what persists, what decays across decades, across political and historical ruptures. This is a crisis that is neither hidden by the propagandistic frame nor prophesied through intuition, but enduring, existing in plain sight while remaining collectively unseen. His work, situated in this liminal space, carries the irresolution forward into the post-Soviet landscape, where the same bodies, the same toxicities, the same erasures persist. It is Mikhailov's work, his traverse through decades of change, decay, and rebirth, that not only teaches us about photography's ability to witness, articulate, and transform environmental and human crisis, revealing and simultaneously contesting the truths of those in crisis and of those outside of it. Whereas Rodchenko frequently repeated images of workers' bodies, forging a sense of seemingly inexhaustible labor supply, as we see with Salt Lake, Mikhailov returns to the body of the collective through the unidealized, the individual. In conclusion, taken together, these artist photographers offer distinct temporalities of environmental crisis. You have the present concealed, the looming and unfelt, enduring and unacknowledged, and in each case, an excess of meaning bulging from the frame. The Rodchenko series, in searching for a capable new visual language, produces a profound excess in the face of totalitarian terraforming, testifying to the very violence that was meant to be concealed. Nigaryan witnesses before the truth is understood, even to the artists, his work retrospectively tied to the elemental catastrophe that followed. And Mikhailov serves as witness not of what was perceived by his subjects, but of what was not, uncovering what persists in plain sight while remaining socially unseen, a dialectic so central to his work to the present day. At the same time, the truth of these photographs often took years, decades, or is yet to surface. Rodchenko witnessed and concealed a crisis that would not be recognized as such for decades. Nigaryan's image became legible only after the Spitak earthquake and the crumbling of Soviet power, and Mikhailov's photograph crises that are often illegible even to this present day. In each of these series, photography served as the medium through which witnessing becomes possible and complicated, concealing crisis as readily as it reveals, sensing crisis yet to come, and making visible crisis society has chosen not to or cannot see. Thank you.
It is so great to be here and to have this audience. This is I feel everyone else, their book is done. This is the first talk I've given on this project, okay? So I get some dispensation for however it turns out. Are you going to time me? Okay. So my title is taken from a 1937 paper in Scientific American, and it is an account of work that was underway at that moment at the Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And this was a station established by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that was at this moment considered one of the very best rising stars in hydraulic engineering. They were doing really innovative work. So I'm going to talk about two simultaneous projects that were linked to Vicksburg. They didn't happen physically in Vicksburg, but they were related to Vicksburg by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and both focused on understanding the Mississippi River. I'm looking at two timescapes that they were working in. One was map time and one was model time. And map time collapsed 2,000 years of delta switching into a single plane, placing temporally distant events in relations in ways that muted human presence on the Mississippi. And what the engineers called model time was the shrinkage of both time and space, so that was required to bring a very large river model into reality. The Mississippi River Basin model reduced river events in both size and timing so that, and this is a quote, because of the distorted scales, humans would be as thin as tissue paper, and 8 hours would go by in 2.4 minutes. Now, both of these projects of reduction and simplification were undertaken by the Corps at the same time during the Second World War. And one resulted, okay. Oh, there it is. Wait a minute. Got to go back. How do you go back? This is picky. Okay. One resulted in the creation of astonishingly beautiful historical maps of the Mississippi River meanders, and the other resulted in a now abandoned ruin, 8 miles long, covering 200 acres in a park. Thank you. In a park near Clinton, Mississippi. The simulations depicted not only the river, but also implicitly questions of risk, values, priorities, and dark future imaginaries, of which the worst and the darkest was the risk. That one's not working. Yeah, it's not working. This one at least is working a little bit if I hold it up. There it is. The worst was the risk that the Mississippi would change its course and sooner rather than later abandon Baton Rouge and New Orleans and go down the much steeper and shorter Atchafalaya to the Gulf. And as you can see here, the river is already by the 40s giving signs it's beginning to flow more deeply into the Atchafalaya Basin. And in this larger map, all of Louisiana, you can understand the placement. The Atchafalaya is a very rapidly moving river, and the existing track of the Mississippi takes a long time to get to New Orleans. Between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, I think it's 8 major ports and many petrochemical plants, and it's a really important river and entryway for U.S. security and economy. So both projects involve narrow perspectives on massive events that cross time and space. We would call this thin simulation. My questions are about how the engineers modeled this world and what their models tell us in this case about Louisiana's mix of land and water with its layers of, this is a long list, locks, dams, fish farms, sluices, mat casting fields, spillways, levees, dredge spoils, oil and gas pipes, wells, and still sometimes magnificent cypress trees, and that is a bald cypress. I took that picture in December. Now, this is the nature, so this is a form of nature made quietly generic, and this is a term from the landscape architects, so that it matches the drafts of shipping vessels, it protects pipes from the ships, and it's a match that the Corps is expected to maintain long-term so as to almost be forever. It's not really forever, but it's ideologically forever. Now, I'm going to start with the work of the LSU geologist Harold N. Fisk. Fisk was an Oregon-born geologist hired by the Louisiana Geological Survey in 1935. He had been assigned by the Geological Survey to do test maps of 3 or 4 parishes that ran along the Mississippi. And when he was out in the field, he noticed the abandoned courses, the abandoned tracks of the Mississippi River. He mentioned these in his reports. He published two geological bulletins in 1938 and 1940. And his work attracted the attention of the president of the Mississippi River Commission. This is the federal agency that controls policy and practice on the Mississippi River. And so in 1941, by which time he had joined the geology faculty at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, he was granted a $125,000 contract. This is about $2.8 million in 2026 dollars, to pursue his proposal for a comprehensive map of the historical meanders. I include the other image because the Corps had conventions for how it clumped together the Mississippi. And Fisk's maps followed those conventions and indeed drew on the existing maps that had been constructed over for more than a century. So Fisk had at his disposal a professional waterways experiment station staff. He had helpful raw data drawn from highway construction. He had the oil industry's generous donation of 16,000 deep geological cores, some of them as deep as 13,000 feet because they were looking for oil, but they figured it was important to understand this river. But his most valuable sources were the 1930s aerial photographs of the course of the river. Fisk noted, and this is in his report, quote, "The continuity of abandoned courses of the Mississippi River and its tributaries can be clearly traced on aerial photographs where the scars of abandoned channels and associated features are discernible from the patterns of soils, vegetation, and drainage." As you realize, this is not a era aerial photograph. This is from Google Earth. I just downloaded it a few weeks ago. I went to Cat Island, one of the largest living cypress trees is in Cat Island. It's easy to get lost in there. And I'm going to talk later about this matte casting field in St. Francisville. But what I wanted you to see is how you can see the tracks of the river over time, the past tracks of the river. This was what he mostly cared about. So drawing on these sources, Fisk and his team were able to show that within the past 2,000 years of very short geological time, the river had taken at least 3 different routes through Louisiana to the Gulf, and the current New Orleans route was only about 650 years old. And I just want to show you in this map what the legend tells us. The solid colors are the maps that were recognized by the Corps. Those were real or understood to be historically real moments in time for the history of the river. 1765, 1820, 1880. The Clear River is 1944. And all of these stripy things are clumped together in a parent relation, and they represent what he could see with the aerial photos. Their first publication included 124 tables, images, photographs, charts, and maps. But it is most remembered for the 15 sheets showing the 22 ancient meander courses of the Mississippi, produced with Fisk's data by Corps draftsman W.O. Dement. Fisk did not draw this. He had a professional draftsman who had been loaned by the Vicksburg office for the job. Printed by the U.S. Army Map Service in Washington, D.C., the 15 glorious maps were widely admired even at the time. A lot of people know about them now. If I talk to people who care about maps, they know about these maps. The Journal of Geology said, quote, "This superb work is monumental in its importance in the field of geology," and, quote, "There is probably no area anywhere in the world where deep drillings have been so closely spaced." So the interest of the oil and gas. Now, the maps were false portrayals of the busily populated and industrialized river at that moment, but they were accurate portrayals of what mattered to the Army Corps of Engineers. And Fisk and others concluded that the river could be expected to continue to wander, and told anyone who asked that the river would change its loyalty to the shorter, steeper Atchafalaya route to the Gulf at some point, no matter what the Corps did. This perspective was and is widely shared even into the present. His convictions might have suggested that the Corps could rethink some of the ways it was imagining how to approach the problem, that their strategies were possibly confused and even risky to the very things they wished to sustain, but it did not. Meanwhile, the Corps was developing at the exact same time a plan to build a physical model of the entire drainage basin of the Mississippi River and its system to a horizontal scale of 1 to 2,000 and a vertical scale of 1 to 100, producing, and this is from their report, the appearance of a gigantic relief map with the streams and floodplains molded in concrete in their correct geographic locations. This has to be a photograph from the 1980s. They had already by this time stopped using this Mississippi River Basin model. This is a site that is 210 acres and it's 8 miles long, 8 miles of river course in here. So the Mississippi Basin model was and still is the largest hydraulic model ever built. Construction began with German prisoners of war in late August 1943. It continued with civilian personnel of the Army Corps of Engineers. Testing on some sections began in 1949. The model was completed in 1966. The last test was in 1973, and the model was abandoned by the Corps in 1990. It was the site of 79 simulations. I don't know which one this is, with each simulation taking anywhere from weeks to months. It enjoyed one major victory, always discussed in Army Corps of Engineers publication, and that is that in 1952, information gathered using the Basin model helped prevent a major flood in Omaha. The tests run on the model were tests of technology, not of the river's nature. Generally, both in the United States and in Europe, river models could show that a dam or a spillway or a levee would work or would hold under given flood conditions, but could not or were not expected to explain the hopelessly complicated, whatever they might be, riverine laws. Albert Einstein's son Hans was a hydraulic engineer at Berkeley, and he worked extensively in the Atchafalaya and the Mississippi with the Army Corps of Engineers. He played key roles in the planning of the Old River Control Structure, which is the key structure that will fail if the Mississippi comes down the Atchafalaya. And he reportedly, and this is from other historians, had a running joke that his father had originally wanted to study rivers, but ended up focusing on physics because it was easier. Generally, using the Basin model, even to test technologies, was difficult. A model of this size required at least 600 data points, 600 either observers or testing materials. And it also meant that 1 hour because of the size, 1 hour in the model took 13.5 seconds, and a real-life discharge of 1,000 cubic feet per second was in the model reduced to 10,000 cubic feet per second. I don't know how you measure 10,000. So the eventual so they asked these companies if they could build an automated system because they couldn't get 600. You couldn't even get 600 engineers to be perfectly timed right. They had to be within the second timed right. So they found a company that could build an automated system, and what they got worked as a collective machine in prototype hours. Everything turned on with the same switch. The entire test took place in model time. A final 3-week emergency test at the Mississippi Basin model during a devastating flood in 73 showed that the Morganza spillway, which had been built in 53 but never used up to that time, could take pressure off Old River Control upriver. They opened Morganza, and the model was never used again. The huge project was abandoned by the Corps in 1993 when it was deeded to the city of Jackson, Mississippi, to turn it into a park. It was already a tourist attraction, attracting about 5,000 visitors a year, because beginning in 1964, the Corps had built a visitor center, had public events, invited people for lectures. And the visitors included Jacques Cousteau, filming part of his 1985 miniseries, his documentary, The Mississippi, which I watched on YouTube a few weeks ago. But the city of Jackson reported that maintaining the site was too costly, and like the Corps, it abandoned the Model 2 around 2006. By abandon, I mean the city of Jackson apparently still owns it, but does not mow anything or clear out the debris. So there have been efforts to preserve it. The Mississippi Historical Commission and a citizen group tried to come and clean it up, but none of the various efforts since then to preserve the model have so far led to improvements, and it is, in all honesty, a bit of a desolate place. I went there in December. I could not even see it on Google Maps because it was so overgrown. I went past some trees and finally found a small sign suggesting a possible direction to go. And finally, I walked across the Mississippi and its tributaries, then quite wet from a recent rain, through the foliage, debris, and trash. Some people might use it as a party site. That's my theory. So both the meander maps and the Basin model were constructed within an instrumentalist vision to figure out how to freeze the Mississippi in its 1940s patterns. Fiske's meander maps provided a historical record of startling consequence if you were willing to listen. The Basin model exemplified the limitations of river modeling as it provided a way to test dams, but not to understand the river itself. In the decades after the war, the Mississippi was transformed from a softer, more changeable system of erosion and new land formation to one that spreading across Louisiana in response, differentially in response to floods and rain, to something locked in with steel, concrete, earthworks, and mechanical controls. So I think it's a lot like Mumbai. The Delta is now a space structured at every level by engineering technology, but also, in my case, a space that crucially still operates as nature and performs nature, where Atchafalaya tours still promise access to, quote, the last wilderness, and in which nature is even still expected to win. And I put the win in quote marks. It is common to describe the eventual flood that will destroy the Old River Control Structure, flood everything in the Atchafalaya Basin, cause extensive damage, and destroy also Baton Rouge and New Orleans, as Old Man River succeeding. Cousteau himself says it in the documentary, Old Man River will eventually win. So I would say that when the old river control structure ceases to hold back the Mississippi, what will win is not nature, but the thin simulation of the Mississippi River model. The tragic event will cosplay nature with devastating consequences. Now, I'm early in this project, and I don't want to go too far, and these are places from my childhood. My mother's home and town were destroyed in the 1927 flood when she was 15 years old. My family comes from the Atchafalaya. I am Cajun. I am officially Cajun. And these are places that I love so much. But I think the Delta and the Atchafalaya are not the only places that have this quality of cosplay, which can also be found, for example, in radioactive wildlife refuges at Hanford or Chernobyl, Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge in Colorado, the dive bikini phenomenon, where you dive there to see more enhanced nature as a result of the absence of humans. And even the Johnston Atoll Bird Sanctuary near Hawaii, or maybe even in other highly managed water landscapes, for example, in Netherlands. These are places that can look like nature and that are organized as spaces for wildlife, but that are also industrialized, instrumentalized, contaminated, filled with human history and with human intentions that are purposely invisible, disappeared, hidden, underwater, covered over somehow. So what is the political ecology of this world? I'm thinking about the Louisiana coast as a place with an incoherent identity, and I'm just going to quickly mention my two sources on this. First is Michel de Certeau, who talks about a non-place, and a non-place in his construction is a place that acquires a functional identity that causes an absence of a place from itself. And I think that's what this is, an absence of a place from itself. And also from Marc Augé's, the late anthropologist Marc Augé's supermodernity. He's talking about supermarkets, airports, hotel chains. And he says these are places that generate incoherence and loneliness. But I wonder if the Delta is a different kind of non-place that plays an increasing role in modern life, a place overrun by machines and pipes and dams, commodification, extraction, exploitation, and profit-making until it barely exists. It generates disorienting feelings of being almost natural or natural enough with trees or water or herons glazing over a situation of profound confusion, and it's on a river that is no longer quite a river. So if malls and airports convey new kinds of loneliness, so too do these spaces that come hauntingly or seductively close to being natural. Every year, the Army Corps of Engineers sinks hundreds of thousands of articulated concrete squares into the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers to fortify the banks. The revetments, as they are known, are typically placed on the river's curves to halt the meanders that Fisk's maps documented. The mat sinking unit shown here weaves together a mattress of concrete blocks, which is rolled out to cover the riverbank in the bottom. This is the only boat of its kind in the world, at least that's what the Army Corps says, and the Mississippi Delta is the only area in the world controlled in this way. So there are many voices and perspectives in southern Louisiana, but for now I find myself listening to the machines, like the mat sinking unit, and wondering what they're telling us. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Susan. I was so moved by your presentation, and what your last kind of maybe five minutes of your presentation kind of begged the question of, is there a nature, a human free nature? Is there a dichotomy that is presented, or rather, and perhaps this is me kind of reading into it maybe a little bit too much, but is it the cosplay of nature that you describe? Is it perhaps the dichotomy that you're kind of claiming is false, and the presentation of an allegedly nature is winning, we are the virus, I'm thinking of the meme thing. Where is the nature, and how to kind of look at this critically in the Anthropocene?
So we can take this. Do you want to answer or take the second question? So yeah, please, in the back.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to, it's for anyone, but maybe especially the last two, and I was thinking about your talks in relationship to the keynote, and I wrote down about resisting essayist approaches, that instead turning to a resistance to narrative and focusing instead on animating archives, shifting temporalities, and there were many other things in that approach. But I was so struck by the nonlinearity of the photographic projects in response to crisis and the resistance to temporality. And I was also picking up on that in the last talk with the different image. I mean, that was less distinct in the choices you made in this early stage of the work, but just the images that you showed were, and was thinking about animating archives and the different ideologies in those images and the different media artifacts and how so I'm sympathetic as I am to rejecting the essayist. It's also some things can't necessarily speak for themselves, maybe in relationship to Julia's question about nature. So I think there's a question in there somewhere. I'll leave it to you to unpack it.
This is from Zoom. Somebody asked, I believe this is for Professor Lindee, could she speak a bit more about the German prisoners of war she mentioned that started working on the river model?
Okay, that's a really easy one, so I'll do that first. They were Rommel's troops from North Africa, and the prison camp was built specifically so that these prisoners could work on the Mississippi Basin River model. The most they had ever working that were from Germany was 1,700 or maybe 1,800. They selected prisoners apparently who had some engineering training, but all they did, as far as I can tell, was move dirt around in the Mississippi sun. And they started in August of 1943, so I can't believe it was fun at all. They were invited back. There was a core of them, maybe 500, that kind of stayed interested in the Mississippi River model, and they were invited back for a celebration in 52 or 55, something like that. They were not released from Mississippi until the spring of 1946. And when I read that, I realized that many prisoners of war in the Second World War did not go home right away. They stayed in various places. So these German prisoners stayed for a very long time. After they left, for whatever reason, I guess because of the war, the Corps didn't have any earth-moving material when the German prisoners were there, so they did everything by hand and with wheelbarrows, and suddenly they got earth-moving material, and all the rest of the construction was easier. So that's about all I know about the German prisoners, but I know they did go back. Some of them had a positive memory of the work. So I think I do think for all of us, the question of where is nature, or what are we willing to call nature, is relevant. Like, how are we going to think about that? And I think, but I'll just say, I struggle with it so much, and it's this feeling of alienation in a place that in my imagination as a kid, I was in there all the time. My grandfather had camps in there. One of the first photos of me is in the Atchafalaya, and I thought it was the most natural place in the world, and even when I was a kid, it was not. It was a heavily modified location, but when I was there. So how is it, so we go around all this nature that doesn't quite reveal what it truly is, and maybe it's just the Anthropocene. Maybe there is nothing. I don't know. Look, I know about radioactive fallout at the height of the Cold War. There's no place in the world that isn't marked by carbon-14 as a result of the radioactive fallout from all those weapons tests. So is there some place? I mean, maybe this is just a particularly dramatic case of it, but even the depths of the ocean and up in space, I can't think of any place that there isn't already human intention, human intervention. But with that, I will see what my colleagues think.
Thanks for the questions. I think to Julia's question about where is nature, I recall David Harvey writing about how, I paraphrase / quote, in the final analysis, there's nothing unnatural about New York City, right? And this is also builds on William Cronin's work in Chicago, where he talks about a second nature, right? Chicago being produced in a second nature. And so I think that's kind of how I would answer the question, maybe, to think with that. The concrete I talk about is a transformed nature of sand and aggregate, mined from hills and undersea, sand, right? And so, river sand, sorry. And so that's kind of how, like, concrete is nature, right? Like literally composed, materially composed of different materials, extracted and alienated in different kinds of processes and ways. But to think with also with the transformations in which, you know, we're living in the wake of massive transformations as well. Part of what I write about in the book is a massive flamingo population in Mumbai, which proliferates in the transformed industrial soup that is Thane Creek. 160,000 flamingos now come to Mumbai because it's transformed, because of the sewage. And so then what do we think about birding? Like, what do we make about that kind of nature? What might restoring look like in that space of transformation? Just briefly on the shifting temporalities, despite efforts to flatten time and space, coastal cities everywhere continue to be subject to cyclical time. I'm thinking of Aqualtas in Venice or in Mumbai. The stormwater engineers in Mumbai work very hard through the year, even when it's not raining, with their intense activities being not attached to like linear time, but to the phases of the moon. And so those temporalities continue to matter in the city.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I really quickly also want to Julia's, because I think that you know, within your talk, so much of what was nature is in relation to control, right? So it's in relation to the other, just like the history of objectivity has often been, as was discussed earlier, it's in relation to whatever that moment's definition of subjectivity is, instead of objectivity as such. And I think that's it's interesting, one, thinking about the bathers in, you know, a polluted lake, and what Mikhailov, he calls it, it's like the Russian Ganges. And he was like, you know, they're there, they're happy as they can possibly be. They feel like this is nature, even though some of them are literally like playing inside and on top of these massive industrial pipes. And also even thinking about with Rodchenko, right, there's this big shift under Stalin during the first 5-year plan where, you know, rejecting these romantic idols, you know, where like this is, you know, this like natural idyllic nature, that's of the past. What we have now is we need control. And that's why it was also a question of control over human nature, but then nature itself. And then the question of temporalities, and also if something can't speak for itself, I think that the last series of Mikhailov actually speaks to that immensely, in the fact that it actually technically, I only said it has 2, it technically has 3 names, the series, which is trial of death, temptation of death, and then into temptation of life. But then the English language version has nothing with it. So you have absolutely no idea where these photographs are coming from. You have no idea what the background is. And so there is some excess that I don't even know if like having some kind of caption or having some kind of like framing, if that would aid that.
Thank you. So, yeah, we have 3 more questions. We can take 3 more questions. Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. So as a medievalist historian, I think it's closer, you know. Okay. I was wondering if, so I immediately, from the very beginning, I started thinking, what about Venice? What about Hadrian Wall? What about China, you know, China Canal or China Wall, or, you know, any construction that really had to fundamentally transform the ecosystem, or just the area, or pasture land, or anything. So I was just wondering if, and also following up on Julia's question about where is nature. So we have this emotional attitude to nature in our industrial society. So I was wondering, do you think this is a historical category, this relationship with nature? Because the relationship of those communities with nature was very different. And obviously, I don't know, probably there are different perspectives of how we are looking at what happens and how they perceived what they were doing and how they were living their life. So I'm not sure I'm asking a very focused question, but I was just wondering if the same story that you are telling or you're weaving based on our modern experiences, can the same story be told historically? Or is it, as I said, a historical category and we have to step back and it's like, oh, wait a minute, methodologically, maybe it is different.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. I have a question for Nikhil. Julia actually somewhat stole the entire framework of my question. I'm also a medievalist, so you're going to get double medievalisted right now. So Nikhil, I've loved your paper. I found it super fast. All of your papers were incredible. My question is kind of bouncing off what Julia said. Thinking about desiccation and drainage and the creation of territories of land, what you're talking about is like a very modern urban environment. And I just wondered if you could put that, if you had any thoughts on putting that more in a longer historical context. I'm thinking specifically of Rome, where the 7 hills of Rome are each separate villages originally, and there's just marshland in between them. And to create Rome, they have to drain all that marshland and pave it over, essentially, create all these forums, and they do an okay job, but then like up into like the classical period of Rome, everyone's just getting malaria constantly because they live in a marsh. So I just wondered if, I mean, I know that what we live in now is different than 2,000 years ago, right? But I wondered if you had any thoughts on how it's different, how the story of the city and of desiccation is different than what previous similar works of land clearance and landification have done. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. I think, Mikhail? Yes.
Thank you. I have one question for Samuel and one for the other two. So Samuel, especially for the second artist, I'm curious whether earthquakes are something in that particular region are understood to be having some kind of cyclical element to them. This is very much the case in Japan, where earthquakes are, they're never predictable, but they know one is imminent because one hasn't happened in 70 years or 100 years, etc. So in that sense of looming crisis, is there ever an understanding? Was my question. For the other two, and Samuel, you are exempt because you live 3 hours away from Philly and you've been commuting, but the two others are teaching in Philadelphia. So I'm curious, as scholars of water and rivers and land, how do you think about the Schuylkill and the Delaware, and when flooding happens in Philadelphia, including here on campus, what goes through your mind as specialists? That's my question. Whoever wants to start.
Oh, I'll start really quickly. So that's actually a great question. My geological knowledge of Armenia is unfortunately not the greatest, but not that I know of, though I think if that is the case, then that actually adds a completely different layer that would be incredibly productive. So thank you for that.
Okay.
I work on cities.
I work on cities. I can respond to the Philly question as well. But let me start with the more historical questions, I think, which are super. I think, I done a lot of my thinking through categories and terms through like Raymond Williams keywords. The theme of like a previous or orienting around a previous World of Humanities seminar. But these words like nature or culture have meant different things at different times, and of course Raymond Williams does not go that far back, but enough to know that nature was not something we longed to get back to at one point of time, but something to fear and be away from, and not unlike the idea of wilderness as well, right? Wilderness was described to be a fearful place to be and be in. And so I think it's also about noticing the different valences that these terms have had in the English language here with the word nature through history. I think is really important. I'm thinking a little bit also of the transformation of terms like water as well, plus 500 years. A very nice essay by Chris Hamlin describes the transformation from waters in the plural to water in the singular that was affected through a late medieval, early modern moment in which, like, the magical properties of healing water, for example, that you sought out water because it was a plural, because it had things in it, was transformed into an idea of water which is empty, which is H2O, right? Which happens at a certain moment of time as well. So I think that those transformations are important to sort of like hold on to. In a way, we're like thrown back into a world where water is plural again, given the disrepair and the inabilities of infrastructure to singularize water consistently. Flood water and sewage water mix very regularly with drinking water, for example, in the work that I do. So I think that's one way to think about the changing meanings of these terms over time and place. I think the question you bring up is that, you know, projects to desiccate are not new. I'm actually interested in the way like that desiccation and permeability dwell together, because they can. I don't know enough about the draining of the Pontine marshes, but I'm thinking of this book, Dreaming of Dry Land, which looks at Aztec histories and the making of Mexico City. And the relationships with water were about dryness, but also about living with permeability in what is now a drained lake, right? I also don't want to like fetishize living in wetness, as you describe, because it's full of mosquitoes, right? Or other undesirables, right? I had a leak, as many others did during intense cold, only to remember that that can also be a problem. And then finally, thinking about Philly and Schuylkill in the Delaware, I think we did a comparative project between Philly and Mumbai, you know, ways of regarding and treating water in cities. I mentioned the engineer Buchanan, who went from Rangoon to Mumbai, and water engineers are going very much between different cities around the world. The standards around water pipe diameters are the same around the world as well. To talk about a shared episteme and a shared knowledge base, right? To say that the canalization of the Schuylkill, the canalization of the Delaware are not too different from ways in which rivers are treated farther south, as Susan was talking about, are productive of flood. So when the 676 floods 3 years ago, it's because of that project of canalization. The flooding of South Philly and the insurance rates that residents are feeling pressed to address has its roots in the landfilling of what were the wetlands south of Philadelphia, right? So where the airport is, the Heinz Refuge is, Southwest Philly is basically built in wetland, and we are reminded of that whenever there's a flood in the city. It's in Southwest Philly. So I think that there were ways in which my colleague Christina Lyons has pointed out that water remembers where it once might have been.
I'd like to address the question of the longer historical arc of this kind of a situation, because we can think of many, I mean, Venice is a good example. We can think of many places where significant development occurs on the edge of water, around water, inside water, and is affected by the risk of flood all the time. It's not new exactly, but I am willing to propose that there is something different going on now, and that it is, and it might relate to we're not afraid of wilderness anymore, not even close. We can't even find it. And it's the level of manipulation, you know, and I talked to a Corps guy who said, For every kilometer of natural bayou in the Atchafalaya, there's 2 kilometers of dredged canal. So it's twice as much dredged canal as, so this is like like maybe we sometimes feel kind of overwhelmed by modernity, like we're overwhelmed by all the things. It's like this space is being overwhelmed by the level. And I think scale and level does matter. Yeah, every city, and Philadelphia, every city struggles with questions of water. The Netherlands are struggling with all these questions. But we're somewhere, and I'm going to try to figure out what I mean by that, but I believe we are somewhere different in 2026, and that it might be important to try to understand what that means and what it means for us and for the way that we think about the natural world. And I'll just close by, I'll close by saying we all had engineers in our story. And sometimes I think we live in the world of engineers. This is the engineered world. I was obsessed for many years with the novel, The Magic Mountain. I must have read it about 10 times. And it is about the engineering view of the world. That's what the real theme of The Magic Mountain is. And maybe that's our world. That's what we live in. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's kind of how it feels right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think we need to, wrap up this session. Yes, thank you so much.